All right, so that's the first assignment. The other one is pretty much just the first of the work in progress assignments that you guys have to do. I assume for many of you this is going to involve, I'm still fixing my rig. That's fine for this one. It would be cool if you maybe could like start setting up some stuff for your scene, maybe like doing some block in for environment. But again, I do realize that a lot of you guys are still working on your rig, and that should absolutely take priority. So basically, again, this is just one of those little things where like submit whatever progress you've been working on. Here's like a list of requirements, like if you are doing texturing, this is kind of what you'd submit. For animation, this is what you submit, etc. And again, for rigging, just like send me whatever the most updated Maya file and the sort of like list of changes that you made to that. These are submitted as journals on Learn. I think it's pretty much more or less the same thing on your end. It just shows up differently on my end. You should still be able to submit your files and stuff like you've been doing for regular submissions. And you can just keep tacking on journal entries if you forget something or like want to append something onto your submission. These again are graded mostly on not so much like what you're turning in, but how well you're using your time. So basically, something like a 1 is going to be, have you done almost nothing? Like, have you just sort of like put a few cubes in and that's like all you've done all week? 4 would be, I've blocked in all of the main, like if you're doing post-apocalyptic scenes or something like that, I've blocked in all the major trash piles and maybe done some work on figuring out how to make trash piles look more like trash piles. Maybe started working on some buildings, stuff like that. So it's mostly just like how much effort does it seem like you've been putting in? If you sort of continue in this way, does it seem like you'll be on a good track to actually complete all of your assignment stuff by the time the final is in? For what to submit, again, there's sort of specifics up here. I am to an extent leaving it up to your judgment of like kind of whatever makes sense depending on what you've been working on. And just if you could just drop a small list of the things that you've worked on in the submission comments, so I know what I'm looking for. So like if you send me a Maya file with a bunch of trash piles in it, I will have no idea what that means. But if you're like, I was working on procedurally generating trash piles to reduce, environment modeling time later, that's much more descriptive, and I'm like, oh, okay, that makes more sense. I know what I'm looking at now. So that's the work in progress. Again, does that make sense to everyone? Anyone have questions? Okay. Yeah, so that's pretty much the assignments. Again, these are due next week. The rig is due on Friday. I did write, I think in the email, if you haven't gotten the rig working by, I think I said February 14th? Week 7? Did I say week 7? Okay, I guess it's like the 17th, 18th. Sorry, I was like emailing 8 bajillion people this morning. I lost track of dates. So if you haven't gotten the rig working by week 7, which again I think is the 17th or 18th, I'm going to make you use Skelebot for your final. And that's mostly because if you don't have a rig that is like mostly not broken, or your rig can't be animated by that point, it's going to hinder your timeline. You do obviously need time to actually animate stuff. So just be aware of that. Obviously it's easier and better to sort of get the rig done as soon as possible. Also, then you never need to think about it again. I'm sure you all probably hate rigging by now. So that's that. Any questions about any of those, assignments, etc.? Okay. Before, I promised you a quick demo of doing a walk, and I also want to explain a little bit sort of my recommended file structure for sort of setting up your rig and your animations. Before we do that, this is the one and only time I'm ever going to make you guys exercise. I have some dumb activities. Everybody rise. Good morning. So basically, I see a lot of common things when people are animating walks particularly, especially if you've never done it. So I want to sort of make you guys aware, hopefully by making you move around, how the body sort of works. So the first thing is just like put your arms by your side, pick a leg, I'm going to use my right leg, and just sort of move it out to the side of your body. So as you're doing that, what do you guys notice your body is doing? Like, do you notice anything?
Tilt to the side, kind of slightly.
Right. So like paying attention when you're doing this to your hips, your spine, what the rest of your body is doing. So for me, like Harley said, my hips are moving to the side. Oh my God.
too much. And they shift, so like whatever leg I pick up, my hips are gonna shift over the other leg to preserve my center of balance. Warning, I'm making everybody exercise like a crazy person.
This one is like there's something on it.
I think I also stole the mouse from that computer yesterday. It seems like someone stole it back. So be aware of that. Also, like, so I noticed some people like bent, they bent really far over with this side of their body slanting out and this leg going up to counterbalance that. Cannot balance this morning. And then it's like, so for me, like my hip shifts over and I don't lean so much out to the side, but like my spine sort of curves so that again, my center of balance is maintained over the only point of my body at this point touching the ground. So one thing I'd recommend if you guys are, animating, having trouble sort of figuring out what your character should look like, or maybe your animation looks a little stiff, get up and actually do the motion your character's doing. Just do it in the labs. I did that all the time, like nobody cares, they don't even notice. So that's one thing I would highly recommend doing. Next thing I'm going to make you do is just like, we're all just going to like take a lap around the room awkwardly. And again, pay attention to what your hips are doing as you, pick up one foot and shift your weight to the other foot. Pay attention to how your spine is moving. So this is all circle awkwardly. And one thing you can do to sort of like help you visualize things is actually like put your hands on your hips. So you can physically feel sort of how they're moving. So does anyone notice anything in particular like that your body's doing as you're walking? Again, paying attention to specific like your pelvis, your spine, that kind of thing. Anybody? Yes. So that's like kind of the main thing. Feel free to this first. That's kind of the main thing that I wanted you guys to like notice is one of the weirdest things I always see with walk cycles is there's like no translation of the hips at all, and the legs just sort of move while the hips just like glide.
These are robots. They move differently than humans.
I mean, that's true, but they're designed as humanoid robots, and it's kind of weird. So, like, the sort of purpose of this assignment was to simpler rig, but still human animation, which is also one of the reasons that there was a humanoid requirement. But, yeah, so again, sort of like pay attention to how the hips move. A lot of times there is sort of like shifting back and forth, not only side to side, but there's a little bit of rotation as the character moves. And again, hopefully the reference will sort of help you guys with that, because that is specifically something I'll be looking for, is like how your pelvis and how your the root of your character is moving. All right, that was pretty much my weird exercise bit for the morning. Anybody have any additional thoughts, comments, questions about that before we move on to other less weird things? All right. So I did really quick, just want to sort of, before we do a quick demo of like an actual walk cycle, again, assuming Maya doesn't explode on me, but really quick, I do want to talk about how you should be sort of, or how I would at least recommend you guys set up your project folders. Do you guys want the lights turned off, or can you see?
Can you put them on?
Sure.
It makes me sleepy.
Gotcha. But yeah, so first thing obviously you're going to want to do with this is set your project if you've not been doing that already. I've just made a stupid project folder in the default Maya project folder area. So make sure you do set your project for this. And then I would highly recommend referencing your rigs into whatever files you're animating. So basically what you're going to do is create a rig file. Why is my outliner over here? And this is going to have no animation. It's just your robot, all of the controls. Everything should be organized the way you want it. Okay. Fun. You can see I have this is pretty much the final robot rig. If anyone wants to follow along with this, this particular file is in the Maya file Google Drive, just as robot caricature rig. Alternately, you could pull up your own robots and do some test animations if your rig is ready for it. But this is pretty much just finished, clean rig. Again, no keyframes, no translations on any controllers, anything like that. So you want to just sort of keep this file, and this is what you're going to reference into your other scene. Anybody remember off the top of your head the difference between referencing and importing? Okay. So importing is basically, it's kind of like copying and pasting the information from one file into another. So if you modify the original file, you still have the unaltered information in the second file that you've imported that data into. Referencing, for those of you that are familiar with coding, is kind of like the same thing as a pointer.
Basically what it does is it behaves more or less like an import, except if you modify the original file, it will change everywhere that you have a reference to that file. So it's really handy for rigging if you're like, oops, there's a mistake in my rig I need to fix. I forgot an attribute, something, weird happens like that. You should be able to go in and update your rig file and have those changes just sort of roll over into any files that you've been animating that rig in if you've referenced your files. So I'll show you where that's helpful. I realized I forgot to add an attribute on the foot of my character, so I'll show you sort of like how that works. But basically the process for actually setting up a reference is just go to File, Create Reference. If you want to, you can open your settings. So this bit is optional, the opening the settings bit. If you have like a super long file name, like robot character underscore rig 12 or something like that, I'd recommend unchecking use namespaces. Basically what this is going to add the file name as a prefix to every single object in this reference. And you can just say resolve all nodes with and substitute it out. Instead of using the file name, you could just do like rig or like whatever your character's name is, or like something shorter so that you can actually still read whatever comes into your scene. So I'm just gonna call this rig, and I will just go ahead and reference this in. It's gonna pull up the window, looks just like the importing window. And basically I'm just going to find this finished rig file that I've already set up and saved, click on that, and it's gonna pull all of my rig stuff into my scene. So you will notice that, again, everything has been labeled with this like rig underscore whatever. It's added that little string that I inputted. It's added that as a prefix to every single object that I brought into the scene, which again is why I recommend not using something really long like robot character underscore 12, because this will be robot character underscore 12 dot model or something. It's just hard to read stuff, honestly. You'll also notice, so I can go through and I can animate this, do whatever I want to this, but if I try to, say, delete a control, it won't do it. It's flashing the error at the bottom, if you can't see this. Cannot delete rig root control as it has locked or read-only children. So anything that is in your rig file that's referenced in is pretty much always going to stay here unless you delete it from the rig file. You can, hide the controls, but you can't remove them from the scene. I'm actually curious. I've never tried to. Okay, you can actually apparently delete display layers. But that's basically sort of referencing versus importing. Does anybody have any questions on that? Okay. So what I'm going to do is just sort of save this file as, say, animation. And again, I just sort of recommend versioning your files as you do things. But I'm going to go ahead and add a little ground plane into this. And we'll just sort of start doing some kind of sketchy little animations. I will add this to a ground plane, to a display layer, and set that to reference so I don't accidentally select it just because it's kind of annoying. All right, so I actually do not have reference. I'm just going to wing this. I mostly just sort of like want to show you like how the foot controls sort of work practically for animating. But there's a bunch of interesting sort of useful images on Google if you're ever looking for breakdowns of walk cycles. So most people would sort of consider basically like 4 parts to a step, more or less. So you have the sort of like first part where, say, this character's right leg is behind him, it's about to lift off the ground, and his left leg is forward, about to touch down. Next thing is, as the character moves forward, that left leg starts shifting back, the right leg comes forward, and then you have basically second contact where instead of the right leg being backwards, it's forwards, about to touch down, the back one is about to come off the ground, and it kind of just like repeats like that for eternity. You'll also notice again, this one's pretty over-exaggerated, but there's a lot of good sort of visuals of how the head is moving throughout a walk cycle, how the pelvis is sort of shifting up and down. So that can be good if you're just looking for a very like simplified breakdown of a walk cycle. And actually, I feel like these are actually really sort of helpful to make walk cycles in particular for gaming stuff. So I'm just going to sort of use this as a guide and go ahead and start having this character walk. And again, this is probably going to be like a really janky little animation. So what I'm going to do is just sort of start moving my rig, and I'm just going to, again, sort of use this, since I don't have reference, I'll use this image to sort of like follow along with these poses as we go through things. So how you choose to animate is completely up to you in terms of the order. What I would recommend doing is sort of picking, like if something is in contact with the ground, I will usually animate that first. And the reason I do that is, you know, if something, like if I move my leg really, really far forward or something like that, and my hips are physically incapable of making that work, I would rather know that sooner rather than later. Like this, there's no way that I could make that touchdown properly. So again, personal preference, it's just sort of how I do things. So usually what I'll do is, again, just sort of start moving my legs, moving my hips at the same time, just to make sure that the knees aren't going to be overly stretched. Excuse me. And then I can kind of refine as I go. So you'll notice that I have all of these fairly convenient attributes set up for the foot, so it's really easy for me to just do a nice rotation on the little sort of like ball of the foot. Once I'm ready to, and the foot stays planted, like that's not going to move. Once I'm ready to go in and start refining this further, I can start playing with some of the other attributes. So like for this guy, we have the heel roll. So here we have already kind of that first position from the weird little diagram blocked out. And again, just sort of moving the pelvis so it looks like the weight distribution is like halfway not terrifying on this character. Just gonna go through and like set some sloppy keyframes. Trying, if it will let me. Question mark. That was weird. Okay. So I've actually realized at this point that if you guys have ever like actually paid attention to how a foot moves, so like usually it'll bend at the ball of the foot and then sort of rotate up towards the toes, and then it'll lift off the ground. And this is when I realized, I'm like, oops, I've actually completely forgotten to add the attribute for that. I set it up, I just didn't make the attribute for it. And this is where rigging comes in really handy. So I'm gonna go ahead and save this and open up, so this is rig.ma is the file that I referenced. I have this other version of it, which is rig version 1. And this sort of brings me to a thing that I would very, 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 very highly suggest you doing. And that is have one rig file that you reference and always have backups of every single change you make to a rig. And what you're going to do, so like I'm going to open rig version 1. This is not the file I referenced. I'm going to go in and I'm going to sort of add this little attribute in. Just do edit, add attribute, tippy toe, and just set it up as pretty much the way I set up the rest of the foot controls, if you guys have seen that. And just like hook that up so it's functional. But basically what I'm gonna do is, the reason I'm always saving backups is if you make a change to a rig and that breaks your animation and you do not have backups of that rig, you could potentially lose all of your animations, which always sucks. So usually what I do is I'll just sort of have like a working version list of rigs, and then as I make a change, I'll just sort of overwrite my referenced file. You'll see me do that in a minute. And then if something breaks with that, I'm like, great, I have the other version that worked. I can, you know, overwrite the rig file again and sort of go back and figure out what changed things. Other thing that's convenient is because I've named everything logically, I can just search for tippy toe here and find the attributes in the outliner, which is super convenient. So I'm just gonna hook this up really quick. Again, I'm not super gonna go over this because I talk about it in the video. I just wanna show you guys that we should now have a functional joint. So I'm gonna save this as rig version 2. Huzzah. And then I'm gonna do another save as, and this time I'm going to, again, overwrite this original rig file. This is the one that I'm referencing into my scene. So yes, I do wanna replace it. The only thing that referencing cares about is the file name. So if you change the file name, you can overwrite it as many times as you want. You could completely delete the character out of it. It's not going to hurt your reference. It'll just change what is actually pulled into your scene. So at this point, if I go into my animation, I should, like all of my, you know, really bad posing and animation is done at this point. You will notice if I click on these controls, we now have little tippy toe attributes that we can play with. I think this is the one I did not hook up, but you'll notice again, like this one, we now have this nice like functional tippy toe movement. Anybody have any questions about rigging or any of the stuff I just talked about? Okay. So again, I do highly, highly, highly recommend that you always save backups of your rigs. Weird stuff happens with Maya, leave nothing to chance. I also have a, what is it, in the robot Google Doc, there is, if you scroll, I think all the way down to the bottom, I have some random suggestions of like, if it's me personally, like this is how I usually set up my scenes folder, you know, my source images, whatever, and some other different notes about rigging. I said, you know, I mentioned the rigging, always save versions of your rigs again. I do recommend maybe get together with your teammate at some point and just sort of pick some kind of file structure that you would want to share. It'll just make your life a little bit easier when you're transferring files back and forth, but it's not mandatory. It's again, just an ease of use thing. All right, so as we go forward with this goofy little animation, one other thing I always look for is like sliding feet on the ground. So like if you have an animation where your character is, like this foot should be planted, but it's sort of sliding weirdly across the ground like this, that is something, again, that I will be looking for. So in this case, it should be fairly straightforward since we have these little IK heels. Just go back and set the heel roll to 0. That will, you know, effectively make that nice sort of like stepping motion. Another thing that I look for specifically in animations, and actually is very noticeable even to sort of untrained people that like don't know anything about animation, is what's called IK popping. And that's basically like, you'll notice if I sort of like scrub between these two frames, if you look at what the knee is doing, like here it's a nice bend, it feels like fairly natural leg. And this one, it's kind of like hyperextended and it makes a really, really jerky motion. That's an IK pop. Basically what's happening is there's not quite enough like slack, I guess, between the top of the IK handle and the bottom, so it's getting pulled over aggressively. And you'll actually notice that like before I move the torso, the foot, it's a little bit hard to tell, but it's like kind of off the ground. You notice if I move this forwards, the leg isn't stretched so much. The foot is actually shifting. So basically what's happening is like an over-aggressive version of this is this, where you know you move the body and the IK foot is just sort of like floating in space. IK popping is just like a less aggressive version of that, where usually your character isn't like drifting, but you do get that weird sort of visible part where the leg is like being overly stretched. Does that make sense? Hopefully. Okay. Easy fix for that. It's just a thing you have to watch out for. There's no test for it. But again, you just sort of like shift things around until the legs have some slack in them, and then that pretty much fixes all your IK popping. It can also help you sort of tell you if you're hyperextending your limbs and potentially make your animation not more naturalistic when you fix that, but it does give you some interesting sort of feedback about how you're stretching the character's body. All right, so as we go through and do this, this foot is touched down. This is maybe the point where I would expect this one to be translating off the ground. So I'm just going to go ahead and set a keyframe for that and go forward maybe like 12-ish frames or something. Again, if you had reference, this would be much more precise. And just shift that leg forward. Obviously, I will also need to shift the rest of the body forward with the character. And again, this is completely normal functionality for a rig. You do expect the IK legs and such are not going to follow your character. That's what it's designed to do. And I'll just go through and sort of set the ball roll to 0. And again, this is the part where the heel would pop up a little bit. And you just sort of procedurally go through and basically continue doing this. So again, a few frames later, you would have the foot would be completely planted on the ground. And again, Maya is lagging, sweet joys. Have you guys found this issue on the lab computers where it takes, like, after a few minutes, Maya just gets, like, unbelievably laggy? Because I can't tell. Okay. Interesting. I might, like, I don't know what would cause that, but I might poke IT about it, because for this, it makes it kind of, like, unusably slow, where it's just, like, not even convenient to like do anything. Cool. Like I set a keyframe, it took 4 seconds to process. But anywho, so this is like basically, you know, how you just sort of go through systematically animating. Again, I start with usually the legs and then sort of work my way upwards. But it really is, especially like if you're just doing a basic walk cycle, it's just a matter of going through, seeing like, oh, when do the feet bend, and just sort of moving your feet in a corresponding way. Because Maya is being so incredibly laggy, I'm probably, does anybody like want to see me keep doing this, or just kind of like get through the rest of my quick points and then go into OpenLab? Cool. All right, so I do have like 2 more quick things, and it's going to be really hard to tell because Maya is being so laggy. But if you're looking at this, you know, from the front, I've pretty much set no keyframes on this torso except for just like shifting it forward. And you'll notice that like it's pretty weird looking and very unnatural for that torso to not be moving or rotating at all. So again, please avoid this. This is like something, this would be something where like if you didn't, you know, take the time to shift that around, you'd probably get like a lower grade on the assignment because presumably like you have not spent as much time on it as you could. I think that's honestly like pretty much all of my points for the animating. Again, I recommend referencing your files, and just a random note, if any of you guys, I added this note to the rig assignment itself. If any of you have referenced your model into your rig, I would recommend, well, not I recommend, for me to see that geometry, I need a zip of your project folder with your model file and your rig file. I don't need anything else, but if you don't include the model file, I will not be able to see your stuff. That's pretty much my bit for the day. Any questions on that before we do OpenLab? All right. So OpenLab, I'm gonna do what I did for the other few classes, and I'm just